Welcome to What the Hex, your source for Warhammer Underworlds and under 30 new players that you're going to bring to the game in 2022. I'm your host, Davey, and with me, as always, I got Phil. How are you doing, Phil?
Hey, doing pretty good.
All right, glad to hear it. We are here with a guest host today for our topic of new players in Harrowdeep, bringing new players on. And we've specifically brought on a champion of our local scene, and that's Skyler. How are you doing, Skyler?
I'm doing pretty well. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for being on. You've been onboarding a lot of players, running a lot of teaching games, and so when we realized we were going to do this, we figured we better the right thing to do would be to get you on here. So
I'm excited to be here.
For the context, we're recording this in early December. There's not really any new news. It's everyone's just kind of getting comfortable in the Harrowdeep.
Yeah.
Or not comfortable in the Harrowdeep, depending on what faction.
Fair. I think maybe the only real actual news that's been posted by GW that has anything pertaining with Underworlds is that officially confirmed that Underworlds will be back at Adepticon next year, assuming that Adepticon actually happens. I think at this point it sounds pretty likely given vaccinations and all of that, but I'm not holding my breath. I just feel like things are still too amorphous in the world to really count on that, but it is definitely a cool thing to hope for.
Yeah.
Fingers crossed on this end.
Yeah. Grand Clash on the books, and who knows what else. So yeah, that is exciting. We are going to talk some of our usual sections. So this episode topic was also slightly inspired by some user feedback we got. So in our community shout-outs, I want to shout out Kiney, who I thought his name was Kenny, and then I looked a little closer. It's Kiney, but he's a Brazilian listener, actually. And he pointed out we had been overlooking. We usually try to do a good job of when we talk about a card name, explaining what that card does. But in our last episode, we kind of got away from that, and he called it out. He said, "Hey, I'm a newer player. Like we're still waiting on our Harrowdeep copy down here, and I kind of got lost in that, and so that's on us." And we thought in exchange, in payment, we'll do this episode aimed at bringing new players on, so people can grow that. So a little new player centric, I suppose you could call it.
Yeah. And we haven't done a new player episode for quite a long time. So I think the last one we had was our rules of thumb, which is probably over a year old now. So
maybe more. Yeah.
Maybe more. Eric was on that one. So it's been.
Oh, no, it's at least two then. Anywho, we'll be breaking into that. There was other feedback. We had, I think this name is Lethenum. On the Discord, he was mentioning that we overlooked a card, Path of Order, in our last episode, and that would be a Grand Alliance specific card for, unsurprisingly, Order. And this is relevant to our discussion of holding objectives. And this is a duel. Score this in an end phase if your warband holds 2 or more objectives and 2 or more enemy fighters are out of action. And he said, "Hey, what did you guys mean to forget this?" And no. And I said, "What do you think about this?" And my first instinct is I looked at it, and I don't know what you guys have done much looking at it, but I was like, oh, this is just like kind of a second tier path to victory, right? Path to victory. However, he pointed out path to victory has the requirement that fighter be taken out of action in that round. Mm-hmm. So this one needs 2 enemy fighters out of action, but they could have been taken out in a previous round. So
yeah,
I tend to see cards through a filter of how easy is it to score early, rather than so. For me, my instinct was I think if I had to pick one, it's probably Path to Victory, because engineering that one kill, I don't know. Like if you can get 2, you would have gotten 1. So, but. I think there's certainly decks that'll double down on this for sure.
I think that the new mulligan rule really weighs in strong here as well, because if you don't take it in your opening hand because maybe you mulliganed it out and you score a surge early, you're still getting that early glory, that early momentum. So when you see it come up, you've at least gotten something early to work with, and can start aiming for it. I really like cards that reward out of action fighters through the course of the game instead of having to count on that clutch dice roll in that single round.
Yeah, this is a good point. And is also, if you know you got this in the deck and you're like, all right, let me work towards getting 2 down, and that'll pay off later. So
Yeah.
I think your mileage may vary if you play against a lot of resurrecting warbands. I've been doing some denying of things like clean kills or bold deeds by bringing ghouls back. So, but that may be your individual meta specific.
I think, at least from my experience with the stalkers so far, I'm being forced to be a bit more flex than I used to be. So it's something I'm considering trying out. I'm still on the fence about it. But I think it's probably good enough to make the 12. It's just a question of like, once we have a few more cards, is it going to continue to be good enough? And I'm already thinking it might be like 13th objective card, which you could play a 13th objective now, I guess, but I don't know if you'd want to. But I think it's worth trying. So I'm probably gonna slot it in and give it a go.
And I think it occupies the area of card that should be considered, like a 2 glory end phase score automatically gets considered. We have kind of a small stable of these. 2 fighters are out of action and you're in enemy territory, or 6 wounds worth of fighters are out of action and there's no wound. Like there's quite a few. There's Path to Victory 2, 1 fighter. Like there's these 2 glory ones that are kind of do these 2 things. And so I think you look at what you're already doing, and if you're like, yeah, I want to hold objectives, I really don't want to push all my guys into enemy territory, so maybe this is what I'm going for. So Phil, did you have anything you want to shout out community wise?
Yeah. So I just read because if you've listened to any of our previous episodes, you probably already know that we feel pretty strongly about push cards, and that push cards are like top shelf, very powerful cards to have in your decks. And I saw that there was an article about Mirror Move with the Gloryseekers blog, and I thought that would be pretty interesting to give a look at. And it definitely was. There was some really cool push tech moves in there, things that you can do. It sort of outlined a few kind of edge scenarios, but it's like, hey, these are tricks that you can pull with this card that are like more than the basic, I got a free sidestep or a distraction out of this. It's always fun to see some people like really outlining like how far you can go with some of these cards.
I will leave the article for people to read. I did see there was one comment, somebody giving some feedback that I really liked was because Mighty Swing, you see a fair amount of that, or scything attacks, and if the opponent drives back an early fighter, to reduce the supports on later attacks, a mirror move can be a way to break that scything attack by throwing the attacker back out of range, and then
that's pretty fun.
So, but it's all tricks like that. So worth a read. It's a real quick hit one. Skyler, what about you? Any community shout outs?
Just a small one. Brian in our local scene is a great friend of mine, and I wanted to give him a shout out for a couple reasons. One, he introduced me to this game, and also taught me how to paint. So Wild Hunt is a favorite warband of mine. It's the only one I have paint on, and he pushed me through many painting tutorials and many hours of getting them from start to finish, and I couldn't be happier with the result and learned a lot. He's always painting. He is a huge Warhammer ambassador, and I wanted to give him a shout out.
Well, I wish my first warband looked as good as your first warband. It is really boss. They look cool. So
thank you,
Skyler. That actually makes a good transition. So it sounds like you said Brian brought you in. We're going to do some what the heck is going on with you, and this is a good opportunity. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got into Underworlds, and then tell us what you've been doing lately.
Sure. So I'm a longtime board gamer. Started board gaming in college, and it's only grown since. And I was always Brian particularly was always looking to get me into Warhammer to some degree, and we tried it out, like the 40k scale. We did some scenario play, and it wasn't quite my cup of tea. So he's always been pushing to just kind of edge me in further and further into Warhammer, and I fell in love with a board game called Forbidden Stars, and that's a Fantasy Flight one out of print these days. Still to this day, one of my favorite board games, regardless of IP. And then later on, he tried to appeal to the card gamer in me, and Warhammer Champions came out. Also a dead game at this point.
R.I.P.
Or at least an out of print game. Really enjoyed that. And then he was like, "All right, we're gonna try one more thing. The board gamer in you really likes hexes. Is almost allergic to using a ruler. So this game has hexes, figures, and cards. It's got to be a hit with you." And pushed it to the table. If I recall correctly, purchased the Beastgrave starter set for me, and off to the races.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad that did the trick. So that's part of why we have you on is that you, relative to us, are a newer player to the game. Although now it sounds like a year and a half, 2 years, something like that. Corrected for COVID, I suppose.
The pandemic makes it really hard. Still time.
Some indeterminate amount of time. What I know that you are a big Wild Hunt guy. I think our first 8 or 9 games were you playing Wild Hunt. What have you been doing lately?
Lately, I've been sampling a lot of different warbands and playing a lot of rivals. That has been partly to explore and partly to accommodate new players. When I'm playing those teaching games, it's nice to grab something I'm unfamiliar with to a certain degree. To explore while I'm playing the game with them. That way, I'm getting a little bit more out of it, personally, than just the teaching game that I'm facilitating. But that's my number one priority. But it's nice to kind of get that cursory glance at another warband through these teaching games. So I've been doing a lot of that. Mad Mob has become a staples for me. I played Mad Mob probably 5 times, so staple over the course of only a couple of weeks. But I keep coming back to it. I really enjoy it. It was across the table from me during one of my teaching games, and I was really surprised how well they handled an Arrivals game and in a first game for this player. And then, they kind of caught me off guard like that, and now I'm working on a championship deck for them, hoping to bring that to the local scene in the near future. Sounds awesome. Yeah, I like those guys a lot. I like that they all have kind of different roles. And that there's a lot of cool tricks that you can do with them. Like they're fun in that way. Absolutely. What about you, Phil?
Yeah, so I've just been getting a couple games in. Still been pretty busy lately. So as I mentioned, sort of tinkering with stalkers a bit lately. Need to do a few card swaps. Realizing now that there's a number of cards in the deck that I originally built for the season rotation that just really don't hold up that well. Particularly things that care about pushing objective tokens around. It's too hard to get them flipped and then be able to push them around. And then just to try and branch out and try a few new things, I've been trying to look for an aggro warband, and I think right now, and this is probably not surprising to anyone, Hrothgorn looks very strong at the moment. So I've been looking at Hrothgorn to be doing something a little different, because I've been playing Stalkers a lot since they came out.
Yes, you have, but you waited many seasons to get your Seraphon.
Get my favorites.
So, yeah. Myself, I did finish the Grimwatch. I've got him with some gnarly blood smears on him. I was pretty happy with how that looked with kind of the pale tones I used for them, and then the sort of dark red on that was a good contrast.
Yeah, they look real good.
Yeah, I was pretty satisfied with them. A little less satisfied with my performance on them on the board, but it's been really fun to try out. Especially, I'd played some before we recorded the last episode, and I played some more now. And man, like In the Name of the King is hard work now.
Yeah.
With objectives needing to be delved and being placed in much more dangerous spots. It is challenging. Matt brought Hrothgorn, and I was like, oh, check this out. Like, I think I've got this cool combo. Like, I'm going to have a lot of people in his territory, and he's going to let me inspire. And all I did was just fed him ghoul after ghoul, and Hrothgorn was just like smoking them one after the other with his crossbow. I was like, well, this is not. I fed just 7 glory in the first turn, or in the first round, and
Oof.
I got 1. So,
Oof.
But challenges abound. But I'm going to stick with it. I got a couple tweaks, and I feel like I'm learning a lot too. So it's good to have the challenge.
Yeah. I imagine Phil can relate quite a bit having the Starblood Stalkers with that In the Name of the King challenge. I fielded them recently during one of those teaching games, and I found just the fact that you have to survive the next activation in order to get the inspiration mechanic to pop off was quite difficult.
Yeah.
Yep. It's a lot tougher than it used to be, but I don't know. We don't need to go into a huge like strategy Starblood Stalkers chat, but they have some ways of making it happen where it's still doable.
Yeah. I am enjoying the challenge though. I'm enjoying the shake up, and I'm also liking that I can, if I need a breath back of aggro, that's always available to me. I was doing a lot of faction hopping as well. I've been trying to focus on bringing factions that we don't see as much in our local. So they're definitely, I think both players that played last week when I set Grimwatch out, they're like, I don't think I've ever played them. And I was like, well, here you go.
Here we go.
This is a very different experience than you would have had a year or two ago.
They don't strike terror into your heart as soon as you see them on the board.
Exactly. That's what's up. But let's talk some new players. So we are talking. We kind of came up with some. This is just going to be a conversation about onboarding new players, and this is kind of a good time for it. This is a new season is upon us. It's that time of year where many of us are giving gifts. So you might be giving Harrowdeep to somebody. Somebody might be looking for. Or they might get some hobby money or something like that, depending. But if people are looking for a new game in the new year, how do we help them do that? So we're going to talk. We're going to talk a little bit about some tips for teaching. We're going to talk about what kind of matchups, like what do we recommend for that first intro game, like the very first one. What do we think are maybe some factions that are good for people to start with, and then once you kind of got somebody's beak a little wet on this, then what do they want next? What's a good next step? And I think actually we'll start with some considerations when you're making some of these decisions. And one that somebody threw down here was all of this is going to be in context of understanding the player that you're introducing. So are you introducing a player who like you said, Skyler, when you were introduced to it, Brian knew that you liked hexes and you liked cards and you didn't like measuring and all that sort of thing. Like he had all these check boxes, and it sounds like you had an extensive board gaming background.
Absolutely.
So that's an important part, and however much experience a person has means that you may skip some of these very, very introductory steps that we'll talk about and kind of onboard them a little bit later in the process with a little bit more of an advanced understanding or not. But and sometimes we can do that because it's somebody we know well, and sometimes it's, hey, somebody just walked into the store, and so you might only have a few questions to kind of feel this out. So Phil, you had some thoughts on that with like a player profile sort of thing?
Yeah. So I think this is just sort of a general, like, how do you want to approach introducing someone to a game? And in some ways, I guess, in my opinion, the best way to get someone into a game is to find the way to sort of give them that hook, find that thing that they like, and have them be like, this is super cool. I want to keep doing this, regardless of their understanding of the rules or how well it's going to play. Like, if they just enjoy the experience, then they should hopefully want to keep doing it. And so, like, some of this goes into like, what is it that you're wanting to use to get them into the game? So, like, I think GW kind of does this a lot for their other games too, where it's like, look at how cool these models are. Like, the game gets completely removed from the decision point of where do you start, right? It's like, what speaks to you? And so in some ways it's like, okay, if you know that this person is just like, I don't know anything about these games, I don't really care about like how the rules work, I just want to do something fun, you can worry less about like what's going to be an easy mechanic versus like, hey, here's this really cool thing that I think you're going to like. Let's try this.
Yeah.
So I think that comes with knowing who you're going to be introducing the game to. So this is probably more of like with Skyler's situation, where it's like, hey, I know you because you're my friend, and I know the things that you already like in these other games. Let's try some of those things to get you in. So this is like an approach that you can take for people you know well. For people that you don't know as well, Magic has a sort of profile that you can also use for something like this. For those who are not aware of it, they have Timmy, Johnny, Spike, and then female equivalents of those names. That it's just shorthand. It came up a long time ago, but the idea is that like they created these psychographic profiles of like an archetypical person who wants to play the game in a specific way. And so it's like, because of the way their brain works, this is the type of thing that they like. So for instance, the easiest example I think to explain is with Timmy or Tammy, and that it's like, I want to do big, flashy, stompy things. Like, I don't really care what happens. I just want to see something cool. And so you give that player something that fulfills that desire, and it doesn't really matter if they're going to win or not. They're still going to have fun. So a correlation for this game would be like, I just want to like roll dice and smash things. So you're like, here's some orcs, have fun. So it's not like a hard suggestion, but it's like, I think it's a good way to get to that core of like finding the hook, get the player in.
That's another tool for doing that.
Yeah.
Skyler, you're the one who said maybe the most recent experience with this. Have you done much with trying to, in your recent teaching games, have you been picking out certain aspects and matching them? What kind of experience have you had most recently with this?
Sure. So I've had the fortune of playing with people that I know are really into board gaming on the whole. So I've been able to lean into that and realize that the mechanics aren't going to be any sort of barrier here. And so what I've been doing is I'll actually put out different war bands on a shelf. I've got a lit shelf downstairs, and I'll put them out, and then I'll bring the new player over, and I'll be like, who would you like to play? And I'll kind of just give them an overview as they point, to, this warband looks cool. So kind of appealing to more just right out of the gate, the aesthetics. Like, we have one friend who just kept wanting to try the different orcs, and that made me happy. His first game, unfortunately, actually this is years ago, was with Iron Skull into Grimwatch. This was when we were. This was when we were all fairly brand new and very excited, and when we didn't know the power curve at the time that was the Grimwatch, and we didn't know how poorly aged Iron Skull was. We did not bring that friend into the game, unfortunately. But to his credit, he, a couple years later, I let him know that the rules have matured, and that I had put him in this scenario, right? I kind of set him up to fail. And I was like, why don't you come over? I have a much better understanding of the warbands these days. And I think they all have something very interesting to offer. And you're not just going to be dead in the water like he was in the game that he played earlier. And he picked orcs again, and I just shook my head. But he actually, to kind of wrap this back, he was the one who picked Mad Mob. And then I faced off against him. I brought Starblood Stalkers in, and at the end of the game, I asked him, so how did it go? And before I could even get the final words out, he cut me off with a so much better. And he's looking forward to joining us in the future, which is really great. But
That's awesome.
So how I've been approaching with each of the new players I've been introducing is I've just presented them with kind of a buffet of aesthetics, and then they'll be like, well, what does this warband kind of do? And I'll give them just a slight, almost more narrative overview, but how the mechanics play in narratively. Oh, you're going to be trying to hold down objectives, or you're absolutely going to just trying to be taking bodies off the board, or they have these really clever tricks that are going to be more card focused. Just kind of giving these very light overviews. And people smile and they grab their first warband that they chose, which I've been really enjoying that aspect, because the decision for them has already started. They've already done something fun. This appeals to me aesthetically. I want to see what I can do with this.
Yeah. I like the idea of having like your 2 or 3 sentence pitch for each of the warbands. Like, here's what makes this warband fun, right? Like that's what you want. I think maybe related to that is when you're sitting down, and we'll get into some general tips here, is being able to give that pitch for the warband that you are bringing to the table too, so they understand, like, okay, so I chose Magors, so I'm going to get in there and punch faces. And this person across the table might be, Phil Starblood. So they're going to do some fighting, but they definitely care about the objectives, something like that, But being able to give that pitch so they understand just in like very broad terms, because there's going to be a lot of information to process. So, what other general approach, like what on your general approach to teaching, did you find was particularly successful for you?
Sure. So, a little more background about me. I am absolutely the one in my play group or in amongst my friends that when a new game comes out, people will hand me the rule book and ask me to learn it and help get this game to the table that either they bought and they really want to play, or there's always me doing that as well. With my general approach, right? I think it's very important to come to the table with enthusiasm and to know what you're bringing to the table, to be able to be an ambassador for it. I think there's 2 types of audiences that you'll usually have at the table. Somebody that is okay with stumbling through and learning with you. So if this is both the first game for both players, and you're going to be learning together, you should know that the other person is in for that, because that can be a bit of a slog or a challenge. You're going to take many breaks visiting the rule book throughout, because neither of you have a compass or a full understanding as to what you'll be doing during the course of that game. You're learning together. But most of the time, especially probably for our listeners, they're going to be ambassadors to the game. And so as an ambassador, know the rules as best as you can. Come with enthusiasm. You want to be an example of fun, just in your mannerisms. Like, this is something enjoyable that I'm introducing you to. Mm-hmm. If you can't bring that to the table, then they're going to feel that right out of the gate. And that is something I try to bring to all of my board game introductions. Another thing is it's important to get components into the hands of the players and to get examples in front of them. It's much more effective to actually have what they're learning in front of them, and maybe even having them move it across the table if you're teaching like a move action or something like that, than to just talk at them. There are many different learning styles too. I feel like universally the strongest one is just being able to get your hands on the interaction. It helps lock it in because you're actually going through the motion instead of having that one person sit there and talk at you.
Yeah. To that effect, I like to do the, like you're saying, I'll kind of explain the basic actions, but I'll say like, here's how a move works, and just have them pick out one fighter that they like in their warband, and then say, okay, we're going to do a move with this fighter. Here's what that move would look like. All right, now we're going to do an attack with this fighter. That's what the attack would look like. And then have them actually do it. So you explain it and have them do it. This is if they're, coming from a real base level, and go through a few of those before you even start that first round. I think an extra few minutes spent there will really help them when it comes time to, like, now I have a whole bunch of decisions in front of me.
It's huge. It absolutely builds a foundation for what they're going to be doing throughout the course of the game, for sure.
You talked about the sort of, or I don't know, there's consideration of trying to avoid, like, you want to know the rules as best you can, but we want to avoid bogging things down too much. Right? So for me, because a lot of times, we'll talk about this a little later, but a lot of times you're teaching using rivals, and so you may have cards in that in your deck that you're like, well, it's actually a pretty complicated card. And so if I've got one of those in hand, one of those power cards in hand, I may just choose not to play it. Like, this card might do something cool, but it may be just a little bit much for right now. This wouldn't be an example, but actually, I will say this: if it's a card that ever won Battle for Salvation's Aggressive Defense Award, then maybe just keep that in your back pocket. Aggressive Defense is a famously complicated to understand card from I think the second season, and they give an award for the most complicated card in any pack based on that. And so, yeah, some of those I'll just leave that off, and then the other one I'll leave off. And I don't know how you guys feel about this, but it's great for the new player to play a gotcha card because it feels like they've really figured something out. So if they play something like Narrow Escape, which is a Ripa's card that does one less damage, you take one less damage. Or what was the Amazing Cruel Boys one? The Tough Enough or something.
Yeah, I don't remember, but yeah, it's like, oh, and then we just reaction to reduce damage. So it's that shock of, oh, I guess my attack isn't going to kill you.
Yeah, that's an exciting experience for the person playing it. If you're just learning and you finally figured out, like, okay, let's see, if I do this charge here and get a successful attack, like, oh yeah, I could actually do something cool. That can be a pretty rough feeling. And so I think I also tend to not play gotcha cards. Try to play cards that give people a chance to think about a little bit and plan a little bit. And maybe that's player dependent. I don't know, but that's something I've found.
I think it's good. It's definitely good if it's somebody who is either very new to this game or very new to, like, card games in general. I think if you have somebody who's come into the game from other card games, they'll be used to something like that happening. But if they've never played card games before and aren't familiar with, like, this, like, haha, I've got this answer to your thing kind of effect that happens in a lot of card games, they'll probably be like, oh, well, crap, I didn't expect that. And that can be a turnoff. I think in that same vein, there's also cards that are just, like, it's not necessarily that they're super complicated in terms of rules, but it's like the way that all these different rules interact means that it does something that almost feels like you're cheating. And you're like, well, because of how these things all work together, it actually works like this.
Right.
And so, I get to shut you down or whatever. those kinds of cards I think are definitely not great options. And I don't think there's very many of those anymore, just in general, but definitely not in starter decks. But definitely leave them at home for teaching games.
Well, and I think, as an ambassador, when you're sitting down, trying to bring another player into this game, your goal should be to facilitate fun. You're not there to outplay them, to punch them while they're down, or conceal info, And if you're holding one of those gotcha cards in your hand and you're feeling out the game, you should have a read on kind of the mood of the player you're teaching, and like if they have that strong familiarity with card games, and they would have a really fun reaction of, oh, that's gross. If you played that gotcha, go for it. But if they're struggling and you're trying to, again, facilitate that fun experience, don't punch them. just hold it in your hand, just discard it later.
Yeah.
In that same vein, one of the things I like to do during Underworlds is I tell players that if they draw in their first round or two of play a third end phase card, I let them know that they're more than welcome to hold on to it, but especially in the first round, I recommend just revealing it, discarding it, and drawing another card, because I'd rather have them see more options during the course of their game than sit with that dead slot and be restricted to learning and manipulating only 2 objectives at a time.
Yeah, and the new mulligan rule really helps with that, and I think explaining mulligans isn't super complicated. So that's probably a good one that we didn't even mention, but it's like, hey, this is probably a good thing to talk about when you kick off the game. It's like, well, I actually think that when you're teaching card games, especially since most of the information is supposed to be hidden, but it makes it really hard to know like how to help a new player understand their hand, that I tend to try and say, hey, let's, I usually ask, but in a lot of cases it's like, this is probably something we should do, is play with open hands, so that at least I know what they're looking at and can be like, are they understanding the cards? Are they seeing things? Because if I don't even know what they have, how can I know if they're missing something?
Yeah. I think it's going to be this thing that we hit on a whole lot while we're talking about this, which is gauging your new player's level. So if they're someone who needs that, you may play open hand the whole game. They may be, no, I'm cool. I can read these, or maybe like, let's play the first round open hand, and then from there on out, we're gonna close our hands up, and we'll see how that goes. So those are options there. Although mulligans are great for new players, I will sometimes skip over that if I think that they're potentially, because like if you say, hey, you have the opportunity to get rid of any cards that you don't need or that aren't very good, and they're like, well, I have no idea what's good, like that. It kind of creates like a stressful choice point early on. But
I find that to be true.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I've seen that a lot as we've been bringing more and more people in. We go over the mulligan rule, and very often they're like, well, I'm just going to keep everything. And I'll actually see them during the first round say and think out loud, oh, I should have mulliganed this card.
Yeah.
Because it's during the first round they realize, oh, this isn't going to work out.
Yeah. Which is great, honestly. And so what I often do at that point is that at this point we'd have a chance for a do-over in our hands. If you really want to, you can, but a lot of times we just play with, the first time through, we just play with what we got, because it's hard to tell. So don't force somebody to try to make that kind of decision. You talked about third end phase. So then, once you've gone through a round, you can say like, here's, you can get a sense for, is the player still feeling out the mechanics, or are they ready for a little bit of strategy, like in-game tips and that sort of thing. And depending on, that can be a good time to start salting in rules of thumb, so, hey, you're at end phase in the opening hand, probably mulligan that hand unless it's hot fire on the other two, so.
4 or 5 upgrades in your power hand, probably mulligan that one too.
Yeah. We've got one in here, Phil. I think this is you. You mentioned post game debriefs, right? Like, that honestly, like, everyone should be like, because there's so much to this game. There's so much, so many different combinations and interactions, and so much depth that everyone is basically a learner for a very, very, very long time, possibly always. And so this is something that everyone can always use, but it can be especially effective and really. I don't know, Scott, if you found this. I found it very rewarding to do with a new player and hear them like have those revelations of like, oh, like if I had waited another turn before doing this, or like that's been a really fun way to kind of gauge where our local community is, where our meta is, how excited people can get in the post game and be like, I really feel like some of our players are really clicking on it now. We're like, oh, here's what I should have done, instead of being like, I don't know, that just went bad, or that's really exciting to see someone really take to that piece of it.
Absolutely. It's really, as you've highlighted, I think everybody should be doing post-game debriefs. I think it's a very fun activity right at the end of the game. Like, you kind of just get to highlight the moments that went well and kind of discuss things that you would have done differently, just across the board. But with new players, that's an especially when you can gauge how the match went, maybe what they struggled with, and you can kind of lean into that, or maybe make recommendations for their next game.
Mm-hmm.
I think it also gives a natural opportunity for questions. Just open-endedly, just being like, what questions do you have about the game of Underworlds, which can be fairly complicated, isn't really a good way to like suss out specific things that people are going to have questions about. But if you just played a game where someone was like, man, this thing came up and I did this, but now I don't know if I did the right thing, it gives them like a natural opportunity to be like, I now have this question in my mind that I can ask right now, and we have a like ready-built scenario to talk through it. And I think that can be a really helpful teaching tool. And then also, once players are a little bit further along, like we had mentioned, starting to get into some strategy tips and deck building, that this then also gives them the opportunity to be like, so I included this card to try, or I tried these things. What did you think? Or do you think I should change anything about this? And so it's like you have these sort of natural progressions, but it gives you these nice stopping points to then say, okay, we just played the game. Now we can naturally talk through what your next steps are probably going to be for this deck.
Absolutely.
And I think it just bears mentioning again, like, well, this is good for new players. This is something everyone should be doing. This is something that's going to make anyone of any skill level a better player, because your opponent always sees what you did through a different lens than you did. And it's like, there have definitely been times where Davey and I have had these debriefs, and it's like, sometimes Davey will point out, like, why'd you include this card? Or like, when you did this thing, like, why, like, you probably could have done it differently. And it's like, I didn't even think about it like that. That's a good point. And gives me more things to think about.
Yeah. I love during the post-op when somebody reveals that they were playing a different head game than you thought they were, and vice versa.
Yeah. That's excellent. Sometimes I'll do during a game where I'll say, remind me at the end. I've got a question about that, and it'll be like, I saw a move that I didn't understand the motivation for, and what I want to figure out is like, one of us was not understanding this situation. Either I wasn't, like you were saying, like our heads were in different places, and I don't know if it was me or the other opponent who was maybe making the potentially the wrong call, but getting that sorted out. So definitely useful for all levels of players. But there's some things that have gotten really good about this game for teaching, which is they've gotten much better as the rule books go on, which is also something to keep in mind. Is if this person has picked up an older rule book, you're going to have to help them out. If they're looking at their, Beast Grave rule book, it's going to look a lot different, or somewhat different than their Harrow Deep, rule book. But Harrow Deep has come with it a lot of sort of formalization. I've actually played in my last few games, kind of had the book, certainly the teaching games, had it open there so I can just step by step say, hey, step 1, we do this. Step 2, we do this, and be real systematic with it until people are like, have the rhythm of it.
I was just going to mention that the back of the Harrowdeep rulebook is so good to just sit next to new players, and I absolutely recommend if you have a Harrowdeep rulebook nearby, always making sure it's sitting next to a new player, because they can reference just the steps of a turn, the round sequence. Like, it's so well laid out. I'm really glad that that resource is available now. I do have one complaint with it, though.
What's that?
So one of the trickiest rules I've found teaching new players is that the way that they've structured the new framework for steps of a turn is really good for the most part. Teaching people that they have met an inspiration condition and they can mark, their fighter for inspiration, and this is when they'll inspire. That's been good. That's been something that's been easy to teach and get across, and I can point at when that occurs. Same with surges. But the reaction step has been a trip-up point for new players, because they'll hold on to these cards in their hand that say reaction, and even though they spell out all these different windows, this kind of looks like this is when you have to do the reaction, because that's the reaction step.
Yeah.
And I wish that this said, if you're looking over the steps of a turn, it says activation and then reaction step, and then you move on to inspire and surge. I wish instead it said, once all reactions are complete, then inspire and surge step, and having that same caveat after power. Once all reactions are done, go to inspire and surge. It's created a lot of awkward timing and just uncertainty across the table when a new player is sitting on a reaction card and seeing that there's a special step for it, and not realizing that's only one of the many windows.
Sure. We've talked about, so you talked about the reaction step. Are there other things that either of you guys have found to be a particularly challenging rule to work through with a new player?
A little bit of the terminology, particularly wounds characteristics versus wound tokens. I wish that those would have been named separately, just to really kind of drive that distinction that this is a wound, because calling your wounds characteristic like the capacity at which you could have wounds, it feels like health, and I'm sure that there isn't, or that there's probably some reason that health wasn't chosen, but just the fact that they share that same term can be difficult.
Like objectives and objectives.
That's the second terminology trip up point. And that one's even harder than the wounds one. Very often people are holding objective cards, and they're like, well, this says if I'm holding an objective. And I'm like,
I've got three right here.
Exactly. It's like, well, that's referring to this token on the board. Well, why is that face down?
Well, now it's a feature token, so... No, I think it's a fair point to talk through some of these tricky terms. I think this is probably a good thing to get into, like, post first couple games, to just be like, let's make sure that you understand some of the intricacies of these terms, because there are a lot, and some of them are not as clear as they probably could be.
The flip of it is I do... so I think those terms, and I think reactions, I think are the most consistently, reactions is probably the most consistently difficult thing to teach, because to play them correctly requires a pretty good understanding of the timing of things, which can be challenging. So that's a pretty good raft of tips. Are you guys, anybody got anything else that they want to throw out there for generalized tips for teaching, or should we talk about like how you pick out what that first matchup might be?
I think the only other thing that I sometimes find helps, and this is probably not something you want to do in someone's first game, but sometimes I feel like people will get into a situation where they're like, I have multiple options here and I'm not sure what the best choice is. And you can tell that they're thinking about it and they're like working through it. And sometimes if I sort of see that opening to be like, this is probably a good opportunity to put like winning aside and be like, let's talk through these scenarios and be like, well, if you did this, you'd be like at these chances of succeeding, versus if you do this, you'd be at these chances of succeeding. So, you know, there's some options for you. Or being like, if you see something that's like, you know, if you do that, you're going to be putting yourself in this situation. Are you sure that's what you wanted to do? And they'll maybe be like, oh, I didn't even realize that. I want to take that move back. Because you don't really want to put someone in a gotcha situation because they didn't track all of the things that your warband could do, because they're still learning their warband.
Mm-hmm.
So, like I said, not something that I think you need to do in someone's first game. It can be like information overload. You just kind of like, at that point, you just restrict yourself from taking advantage of them making maybe a mistake. But like, once they're like in the game and they're like, yeah, I get it, but I'm still like struggling over some of the decision points, I feel like sometimes it can be helpful not to tell them like what the optimal play is, but to like help talk through and think through what the options are.
Skyler, did you have a last thought here before we move on to picking that starting matchup?
Yeah. So one of the things that we've been focusing on is if you're the other participant in the teaching game, and very often you're probably onboarding, you know, that one person at a time. But if you're ever in a situation where there are multiple people, especially, you know, two or an even amount of people that are looking to learn the game, I found that being willing to sit out and facilitate that game.
Totally. Yeah, great call.
Is the best way to teach. And anytime somebody has a question, they're not asking their opponent. So you're even removing that, right? So you get to pivot over and over and just always like don't tell the other player, well, they're going to do this, you know, sort of a deal. So I'm going to steer you this way because I know what their cards are. Obviously, you don't want to do that. But I found for that, especially for that inaugural game, right? That is the best way to teach it if you have two people or more that are interested. And I've also discovered that after you've done that, if you can pair those people then to somebody who's more familiar with the game after that match, instead of keeping them playing each other because they're still working through the rules. We made a mistake recently in our play group where we left two newer players alone for their second game, and it was not something that we really thought about. But afterwards, they're like, "Yeah, we really wish that we had played against people that knew more, or we still had that facilitator present, because we found that we were lost more often than not. Our match went on longer than we would have liked. We were a little frustrated." And that was a personal note to take away, that even though they had that one game behind them, that going forward, if you can at least keep some knowledge at the table, even if it's in the opponent's seat, after that, it helps just move the game along and answer those questions without having them to, you know, break to the rule book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up. That was a very good point. I know, especially early on, I would kind of enjoy like getting to the store for our league and just kind of floating among the tables and helping answer questions and kind of watch things and all that sort of thing. And I find now I have much fewer questions to answer. Like I'm mostly just watching some cool interactions and that sort of thing. So, but yeah, it can having that facilitator can really get you some good bang for your buck.
Yeah. I think one last thing that scenario made me think of, and this is something that I feel like you've told this story a couple times, Davey, is that you probably shouldn't try and introduce people to the game in multiplayer. So I don't know if you want to elaborate at all, but I think that's a good rule of thumb to avoid teaching games with more than two people.
There's just extra. The game at its core has been designed and refined as a two-player game. It is possible to play it with more, and that can be fun in its own way, but it is less refined for that. You could make an argument for Arena Mortis, but the problem with trying to do multiplayer with the full warbands is that there just tends to be a lot of downtime, and that includes in the power steps where each person has to pass in turn, so the power steps can really go on a long time. And then just while somebody's making their choices, it's just more waiting time. So it makes it last longer. So I wouldn't say never do it, but I wouldn't make it someone's first introduction, and I would take efforts to try not to do if you've got 4, just do two player games. So
Absolutely. You also get to avoid any unfortunate like ganging up.
sure, yeah,
Yep.
Yep.
yeah. I mean, again, that I spend most of my time speaking the warnings of downtime, but also in this time when I introduced it as a multiplayer game, one player had reavers, and I think he was down to just Garrick with 2 wounds left by the second round.
Oh, rough.
Because everyone was like, he just like, oh, I'll just charge with these guys, and everyone was like, oh, one dodge guys with only 2 or 3 wounds in my territory, don't mind if I do. And so he had a very long game of running Garrick around trying not to lose his last guy. So
But yeah, before we move on, there was one thing earlier that was sparked for me that I wanted to mention. It was, I believe, Davey, you were talking about things to kind of leave out. Going into your first game, and I just wanted to say, leave that scatter template in the box. don't try to teach that out of the gate. If it comes up in the game, hey, what does scatter do? Oh, it's about to, like, we're here, we're at that point. Then grab it. But sure. No one needs to know about that going into their first game.
Fair. So what that tells me is, in your first game, you're probably not dropping Grimwatch into the mix.
They're definitely
some of the other considerations you might have is like decide whether or not. I don't think Magic is all that complicated, but it is another thing to figure out. Warbands that have a ton of reactions or a ton of complicated text on them are probably something to avoid. Soul Raid, cough, who I adore, but that's going to be a tough first introduction for somebody. If you have a warband that springs to mind with that where errata has become a thing, there's Mollog, which has his own issues because he can create such a lopsided game sometimes, but also Thorns of the Briar Queen, where not I'm trying to
Varclav?
say Varclav, where Varclav has been errated a couple times. If you're going to bring one of those warbands, I think you need to consider ignoring the errata for that first game, or just not bring something, because it's really frustrating to have people have to like, hey, I know your card says this, but it doesn't really say that. Let me tell you what it actually says.
Yeah,
absolutely.
That's a bummer. So
I think if you want to not introduce them to the way the card is written and how the errata is in function, maybe do the legwork of just printing out a version of the card that has the errata. I know
sure.
Underworld's DB actually updates those, so you could just get a printout of what that card is. But ultimately, I agree. I think you just avoid it. I think it does lead to kind of a feel bad if they go into championship, down the road, and they realize that, oh wait, it doesn't work that way, and I've fallen for this warband, sort of a deal. I want to field them in championship, and there's this restriction. So, I think, either ignore and then caveat it later, or set them up with that understanding out of the gate by actually having it physically present instead of having to like.
That's a pretty solid idea.
Yeah.
Do you guys have any other considerations? And if not, maybe some specific thoughts on like what you would have that first matchup be like? What do you think is a good teaching matchup out of the gate?
In some of the games that I facilitated, there have been people who have picked the Ideneth. There was somebody who wanted to play Wild Hunt, and in another instance, somebody who wanted to play. Who are the combo elves?
The Blade Coven?
Thank you. Yes. And in
combo elves.
In each of those instances, they have an Inspire mechanic that would normally go off at the beginning of a round, as written. And when we've been teaching people, we've been doing that. We've been letting them, letting the Deepkin, the Soul Raid, have that full round 2 of inspiration, instead of being robbed of an activation. And I know, the rules are written in such a way right now where they would have to wait a full activation. But in those cases, you pull a lot of power, and so you pull a lot of power out of the warbands, but you're you're trying to facilitate fun, and
Mhm.
you're telling them they're going to have a little less fun during the
Yeah.
course of their game.
Yeah. Right, because inspiring is one of the most exciting moments of the game. Like, oh, like my guys all went in turbo mode. Like, cool, let's see what that is. And having to make them wait
Absolutely.
to open their Christmas presents is a little rough. So. Phil, what do you got any considerations, or you got?
Yeah, so I think if so, like I said, you kind of can let people, follow their enthusiasm. And it's like, if they really like a warband and they latch onto it, fine, whatever, just let them play it, and we'll cover all the tricky bits and we'll just make it work.
Mhm.
But if they're like, I don't know, I just want to learn this game, I think in a lot of ways, aggro is a lot easier to teach. So you can kind of pare down to aggro warbands. And then I think warbands that are not very finesse, like you don't really have to, like, if you make a mistake, they're forgiving, I guess, is what I'm trying to get at. So like Stormcast, Orcs, Magor's Fiends, like they're all fairly tough. They all do fairly linear things. It's like, I want to go punch stuff. We're going to go punch stuff. Like, you don't have to think about so like with Blade Coven, it's like, oh man, I want to go punch stuff, but I can't be like too aggressive. And I have to think about all these different little intricacies. And that can end up being difficult when you don't even fully grasp the rules. But if you've got Morgoth's Crushes, you're like, yeah, I got these guys and they're just going to move forward and punch stuff. And I don't even have to really worry about dying because they all have 5 wounds. And so I think that's helpful. I think, like Skyler said, Inspire mechanics can be an important indicator of just, it's going to feel fun when stuff happens. But I think also you don't really want to have to worry about it too much. So I wouldn't pare down by Inspire mechanics, except for some of the most complex ones to explain. I think maybe also trying to avoid some of the resurrection mechanics can be a good thing to stay away from, just because it starts to add some layers of a complexity of trying to understand, wait, counting fighters that are out of action, does that mean that they're currently out of action versus they just came back? And trying to, it opens up a whole nother layer of difficulty. So
Yeah.
Unless somebody really latches onto those, I think they're also good ones to leave out.
Yeah, I think those are all good considerations there. When I'm setting up that first matchup, I like to have both warbands interested in attacking, but they don't have to both be all aggro. I really like having a faction in there that cares about standing on objectives in some ways. And to be fair, even Crushes, they have a couple of great surges for holding objectives in enemy territory. And so I would just want to make sure that aspect's in there somewhere, because that is an important part of the game. And you took all this time at the beginning of the game to put the feature tokens down. So you need to show why anybody cares about them, right? So I think that's pretty helpful. So we come back again and again to the idea that players, if there's something they're passionate about, harness that, right? Because enthusiasm and fun is kind of what we're shooting for, and you've got a shortcut to that state of being if they're already excited about the faction they've taken. And so then sometimes it's just about matching something for them to play against. And Skyler mentioned, sometimes it's something that you might be interested in checking out a little bit, know them well enough that you're not oh, I have no idea how any of this works. You don't want to be doing that. But if you're having fun making discoveries too, it can help. So my first thought when I was looking at this, I actually thought, and this is not all that helpful a suggestion for people who are just getting into the game now, I thought the Steelheart versus Reavers in the very first box, that was actually a pretty good way to learn, because they were pretty straightforward. There wasn't a whole lot of reactions. I think
I would agree.
There were a couple in the cards. I think it was maybe a little lopsided right out of the box, but that's fine, and you can. But again, that's not super helpful. Steelheart versus Reavers are not an easy thing to find, so
it's not. But it's an interesting point for the game going forward, in that this the whole point of core boxes is it's supposed to be a starting point, but the core boxes are getting complicated. Like, it's not just, hey, here's 2 warbands that kind of do some stuff and like very straightforward linear play styles. I mean, like Dread Pageant is both can be a good learning warband, but they have like this really like high ceiling of like learning lots of weird little tricks you can do with them.
Yeah, here's though, I will say, I'll detour and say I really like Dread Pageant as giving, if somebody is down with the aesthetic or whatever, I really like that as I really like them in general, but I really like that each of the fighters have their own little role. Like they each do kind of different things. There's the, healing reaction on there, but they're not particularly complicated cards. And then they're in faction stuff. There's a lot of cool stuff, and there's a mix of things that are like, they have Godseekers, which is have all your fighters in enemy territory, and that can be scored at any time. There's all kinds of ones for holding objectives or holding more objectives. I think there's a lot of great teaching cards in there. And I think, which is actually kind of important, is that they have 4 fighters. I think 4 fighters is kind of a little mini bonus for a starting faction, because people in that very first round are like, oh, well, I'll just do an action with each of the fighters, until they get the idea of like, here's how I can leverage one fighter for more than one action, or hey, I've only got 3 fighters, why do I have 4 activations? What would I do with this last activation?
Yeah.
I have to agree. I think the Dread Pageant is an excellent learning warband. I do feel they're opposite. The Mayari's Purifiers, probably mispronouncing that, but the Purifiers, they are actually one I would leave out. I think they are a lot harder to learn with because of that Aether Quartz mechanic. They kind of fall into a trap of thinking that it's not as precious of a resource as it really is, and there are so many cards that look for it.
Sure.
I kind of think of their Rivals deck as more of a toolkit and less of a cohesive Rivals experience. And to that end, we actually had a new player that was quite frustrated fielding Purifiers. They were so pumped they actually painted up the band in advance before even I know before they even sat down for their learning game. But they played 3 games in a row with the Purifiers and just could not find victory, and very often was frustrated with the choices in their hands. And would be in a place where it would be referencing one fighter, on the cards that they had, but that fighter would already be out or had already used their Aether Quartz token, So
sure. One faction that I thought was kind of surprisingly good for a starter was the I was going to say Condemners, no, but the Storm of Celestis. The shooters out of there, they don't have a lot of complicated things. They do have the sleek reaction, which lets you put people on guard. They have some shooting. They have multiple attack actions, but that's not too tough to wrap your head around. I feel like they have a spread of different things. They've got the 4-fighter thing going for them. So if you have access to everything, I think, Storm of Celestis versus Dread Pageant isn't a bad starting matchup. I think that's a 4v4 without too many overly complex things. And it's funny, as you march through the seasons that are still available on the shelves, like it's like, oh yeah, like I don't know, trying to think of one that was good with objectives, like, oh yeah, there's the Starblood. I'm like, all the skid reactions, that's kind of tough. And then I was like, well, there's the swarm of Canaan's Reapers, like, wow, that mechanic, it's a you have to get a feel for how complicated a mechanic that can people can process. But I think if you are looking for something not overly complicated and might give you a good game and showcases a lot of different things, I my personal one, I think I quite like the Dread Pageant versus Storm for teaching. But obviously with the caveat of whatever people are excited about. You guys got any more thoughts about that?
I think those are both great picks. I think another one to add in is the latest Stormcast edition, Zandiar's Truthseekers. what's really fun about this for new players is when one of their Stormcast figures, is removed from the board, they get to do something exciting.
Oh yeah,
Uh,
that's a really good point. Yeah, I like
so
that.
that so they don't feel as punished, when something's coming off the board because they get that well, here's the final strike, moment
Yeah.
from one of those fighters, and I think that's really enjoyable, and you get that 4-fighter warband as well. I think that's a very solid
Yeah, and the first time
beginner
one of the
warband.
big ones goes down, they get to inspire the other two, right? So like that's a cool effect too. So
I think that's
so
good.
yeah,
I kind of liked your point, Davey, of like keeping in mind when you're teaching which factions are currently in rotation.
mm-hmm.
It's something we didn't talk about really at all at any point until just now. But like, if you teach somebody an old warband that's no longer available and they fall in love with it, you might be setting someone up to be disappointed if they can't find it. So it is probably good to keep in mind like what the available pool of warbands is to buy from if you're trying to get someone into the game.
It's a great point.
It's a really good point. The like buffet of options that I'll lay out for players is always I always keep that in mind and make sure that they're available because of what's exactly been said. You don't want them to be like, oh, I really enjoyed my experience. This is the band I want to carry forward. It's like, oh well, how are your eBay skills?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the advantage of those later warbands too is that they have functioning rivals decks. By
Yep.
functioning, I mean like a legal rivals deck.
They have
right?
enough
Like,
cards.
yeah,
Absolutely.
and that's kind of a big deal too. We kind of hit two things. So I had considered the idea of like trying to set up that initial intro or initial factions, but I think those kind of overlap quite a bit. Do you guys have any other thoughts about helping people with the factions in those first couple of games?
I think if somebody was looking to, I think this kind of comes into play here. If somebody was looking for like a box to pick up to get started with, get the boards, get the dice, and maybe even have, two to pick from out of the box, one for them and one for their opponent. If we have any listeners that are excited to get in, and they don't have somebody that can, bring warbands to them, I think then the Harrowteaching box is an excellent starting point.
Mm-hmm.
The Orc faction is, I would say, arguably more complicated than Truth Seekers because you are going to be dealing a lot more with reactions and keeping in mind your support capabilities. But I think support is a really good mechanic to learn early and get a grasp on. So if you're going to be dealing with, a little bit of extra complication, I guess, out of the gate, support's a really good one to get used to and learn. And so I think that box is just really solid for players looking to get into it as a whole.
I'd agree with that.
Yeah,
Any thoughts?
it gets you the delve and the gloom, which you need to be familiar with now because that's the world we're living in now. If you pick up,
Right.
if you manage to find the Dire Chasm box, that's great, but know that all the lethal tokens and stuff are not going to apply anymore is probably something that's going to maybe surprise people. So something to keep in mind.
And if people do want to pick up a Dire Chasm box, or they find a Beast Crate box and they want to start there, the rulebook, the current rulebook is available online. It can be found at the official Underworld's website. And they could just substitute those lethal tokens because thankfully, they're double-sided. You still got the numbers on one side and something on the other. You could say that the lethal sides are gloom.
Yeah.
Yep.
Just hide in that gnarly monster mouth.
Yeah.
Yep.
Just hang out, close it up.
Yeah. Well, so we've made our intro games, right? We've gotten somebody now. We've been successful with that, and we won't get as in depth here. But what are the next things you're gonna be saying to this player? Like I think we talk about they won't even know what Rivals necessarily is in the first one, but maybe their first 2 or 3 games they're just with Rivals, so they don't have to worry about the deck building. So then they're expanding out. Maybe they're deck building. Maybe they're so what are the next steps here? Would you say?
I think it's something we already mentioned earlier, but we can just say it again, is that now is when you start talking about the rules of thumb. Just give them quick hitting tips. It's like you don't have to really think about this. It's just like remember these like few points, and that'll really help you through your games. And then, like we said, we can start looking at deck building to just start to try and figure out like, okay, so here you've got your rivals deck. What can we like take out and add in that'll help you start to improve the deck?
I found that by the time people have gotten through, 2-3 games, they've identified some cards that they don't want to see again, that they're happy to weed out, and that's really enjoyable because if they continue forward with rivals, that begins to be something that they have to consider could come up. But if they break into deck building into championship, those are going to be the first cards they happily cut and replace with something else.
Yeah,
and those replacements, I think it depends if they already have that starter set, and then I think it's great to go looking in the universals that came with that set. Obviously not the starter, but like the one of the core sets. But if they picked up an individual warband, I think the essentials pack is, and this is not revolutionary to say, I think it's a great place for them to go. There's a lot of really strong choices in there. There's a lot of not strong choices, but that's important as well for deck building, for them to look through and be able to, see for themselves, like, okay, I don't see a reason I would take this, kind of start making some of those decisions is a great step for them. I think you get a ton of mileage out of the essentials pack.
I think Essentials really earns its namesake, and I would absolutely recommend it to anybody looking to get into deck building. It would be my first purchase recommendation. And something you called out was that it maybe look into the box for the universals that came with, and you mentioned, well, not the starter, but with a core box. And it's good to identify that the reason you said that is because there aren't any universals in the starter. It's kind of intended to be paired with that essentials pack if you want to start deck building. So buyers beware, no universals in the starter, which isn't a bad thing, but something to know.
And I guess all of that is sort of a way to say should probably start talking about like what are potential next purchases, where, like, if you're going to grow, where do you go from here? It's important to sort of outline like what does the structure of this game look like if you want to get more cards, what does that mean? I think it can, you don't necessarily, and you definitely want to make the point that like you don't have to have all the cards, but if you want to start deck building, we can figure out what is in which packs so that you know what you want to buy to get the cards that you want. And I think to go along with that, you have a lot of really strong online resources that have a lot more perspectives as well than just maybe what's available in your play group. And so when you feel like people are ready, sharing deck builders, blogs, just giving people resources so that if they want to go out and start learning more things on their own, that they can do that between your whenever, whatever frequency your game nights happen to be on.
Yeah, there's they get to really fall down the rabbit hole if they want, with blogs and podcasts and deck building sites and all that sort of thing. So it's a fun way to create more conversation about that. And I'll often end up pointing people, someone will say like, hey, I'm struggling with this faction. I'm like, I don't know anything about it. I mean, I know that I've lost plenty of times to that faction. So here's things that made me lose to them that I'm aware of. But a lot of times, you can go look in and help them, get them a link to get them started, and then let them explore further on that.
Absolutely. If anybody's looking to like engage with the community or get answers to questions that they might have, and they don't have like an easy resource like to find where those answers might be posted, there are definitely Discord communities out there. Particularly, I enjoy the Warhammer Underworld's Vassal Discord for rules questions. If you ever have any rules questions, there's a channel dedicated there. You post, and it will be surprising how quickly somebody gets back to you with an answer.
Yeah, there's great discussion in those, and I'm hoping that fires up even more as we return to in-person events, possibly, hopefully.
Yeah, we'll see.
So, yeah. I think that kind of covers it. The onboarding of new players. I think it's an important thing, getting more players out there. I mean, we've got now, we had 8 or 9 players that are our last outing at the league. And, with some people who are sometimes there that couldn't make it. So we've been pretty reliable at the 8, and it's just been feeling great to have all those folks out there and just kind of showcase that enthusiasm every week. Like it's been really cool. And honestly, Phil and I didn't do very much about that. Like we just kind of got lucky with some groups coming together, and then those folks recruiting other people. So glad we could have somebody who knows a little more about that on than us. So thanks for coming on, Skyler.
It has been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Sure. Has anybody got any more thoughts before we start to shut this thing down?
I'm good.
All right. Hearing
Same.
none, we'll say if you want to get in touch with us, there's Twitter at WTHcast, whatthehexcast@gmail.com. You can hit us about the Discord. There's a link in the show notes. There's a conversation about all the different shows in the Mortal Realms Network. We now have Path to Story, covering Path to Glory stuff. We have the Story Phase, covering the background of Age of Sigmar. We have Dogs of Warcry, covering Warcry. Those guys are killing it. And then, of course, there's us, What the Hex. You can check that out at themortalrealms.com if you want to just kind of browse around. Coming up, we do have we'll have an episode for the end of the year, and I think what we're going to take the opportunity is to do a little looking forward. So we're going to talk a little bit about what we think is coming, what we hope is coming, and maybe a little bit of looking back as well. It'll be, like I said, we just hit our 3-year anniversary, and we may take the opportunity to kind of reflect on some of the things from the game or some of the podcast, and kind of engage with the listenership about what we might work on, what we might look to do going forward. So look forward to that. And
Happy anniversary, by the way.
Thanks. Yeah, we really blew it out.
It's been awesome having this podcast as a resource, and being able to be a part of the local community here. Both have been just a joy.
Yeah, it's a part of my week I definitely look forward to. Anyway, we do have some recommended listening. We got a track by Perfume Genius called Learning. With that, for What the Hex, I've been Davey.
This is Phil.
And I've been Skyler.
He got it. Somebody dropping cartoon anvils on the floor up there. So
sure, love it.
And I think
go ahead.
I guess I don't think it'll be an issue, but we didn't remind someone once, and then we had to bleep stuff out. So we try to keep it, pretty PG-13. So keep swearing to an absolute minimum.
Totally aware. I'm going to do my best.
Okay. Any swearing you do increases my editing load. So you start swearing, then I start swearing because I know that I got to do the editing, and then it just
sort
goes.
of a react.
But, oh man, I've already lost my train of thought there. Sorry. This might be one of those editing moments.
That will be. I always need fodder for the end.
There we go. So
we're gonna pause for just a second. I'm gonna snooze this. Oh, Dane County is telling me my computer is about to restart. I only have 23 hours and 58 minutes remaining. So.
Oh, only? Is that all?
Yeah. So hopefully we can wrap this up by then.